This happened a while back, but it stuck with me like it happened just yesterday. My buddies and I had been out drinking and finally settled at my friend's house, and I was too drunk to drive. It had to have been about 3 or 4 in the morning. Everyone in the house had gone to bed, and I was buzzing on my friend's couch, starting to fall asleep, when I heard a light tap on the door. I got up to see if I could find out what it was. Then I heard it again, coming from the door. I went to look into the peephole, and I saw 2 small kids dressed in raggedy clothes. Convinced I was just seeing things, I looked at my friend's monitor. Now my friend has security cameras everywhere, and I could still see them. I was about to open the door until one of the kids looked up into the camera, almost like they could see me. And at that moment, my blood ran cold. The kid's eyes were gone. There was nothing but blackness. He mumbled something like, "Can I come in?" Convinced they hadn't seen me, I went back to the couch, listening to that faint tapping and watching the monitor until I dozed off. When I was awoken by my friend, I explained what I saw. Of course, they were convinced I was just seeing things. Now, my friend lives in a kind of rural area. Their closest neighbour was a good mile down the road, so there was no reason for kids to be up that late. I told him I thought the same thing, but I know what I saw. I told him to check the cameras. As he went to do so, the camera facing the door just so happened to cut off. But on the other camera, you could clearly see me looking at the monitor in astonishment. I know what I saw that night, and after doing research about this, I'm glad I didn't open that door. Now, I'm not one to believe in these things, but I know what I saw, and I still have no explanation for it. I live in a small farming town in South Africa. There's not too much around here besides lots of farms and a few nature reserves. The house I live in is a few decades old, and I've been here ever since I was in 2nd grade, so that's around 10 years ago. I live here with my mum, my younger brother, 2 dogs and a cat. And we've also had some weird encounter with something paranormal or some sort of entity or energy. I'll discuss a couple of my family's encounters before getting into my own. This hasn't happened in a while, but my mum said she used to hear something shuffling its feet on the carpet at the foot of her bed. She knew it wasn't one of the dogs because she could see the both of them on the bed with her. And sometimes they would even hear it too and look in the direction of the noise. It wasn't the cat because we didn't have him at the time. And my brother and I were always in our rooms whenever it happened. She also said she saw a large black figure, sometimes during the night, and I think once during the day. Now for my brother's story. The only time I think he ever properly experienced anything paranormal that he couldn't dismiss as something mundane. It happened about a year or 2 ago. He was sleeping in his bed and my mum was sleeping next to him. I think he might have been 10 at the time. He woke up sometime in the middle of the night. The room was dark, but the bright white light from the street lamp outside illuminated his room enough to see things relatively well. He awoke suddenly for some reason, and after a few seconds, he noticed something at the foot of his bed. Now for some context, his bed is a large queen-size bed that was in the corner of his room, and it had a large gap, enough room for a person. He looked at the foot of his bed and saw a black figure. It was sitting with its knees hugged against its chest. He blinked. He looked around and was certain that this was no trick of the light. And it wasn't some random object that looks ominous in the dark either. It also wasn't sleep paralysis. He could move, and he could feel he had total control of his body. But he was too terrified to move. After a couple of minutes, he decided he would very carefully attempt to wake our mum up, hoping that she would be able to do something. He slowly reached over to her and began shaking her lightly, but as he did so, the figure, which hadn't moved at all, suddenly turned its head around and looked directly at him. He froze, terrified beyond hell. He could only make out the rough shape of a person, since it seemed to be made out of shadow and darkness, but he could see 2 glowing white dots for eyes. After a few moments of frozen horror, he started to shake Mum again, a lot more violent and urgent this time. Thankfully, she awoke quickly, and just as she began to sit up, my brother saw that the figure silently jumped off his bed, onto the floor, and under the bed. Now, time for my story, the first one I can remember. I was getting ready for school one day. This was when I was still in grade school, grade 5 I think. My desk was at the end of an L-shaped hallway. If you imagine a hallway in an L shape, my desk was at the bottom short part of the L, if that makes any sense. My desk was also right next to a glass sliding door that connected to the lounge. I was packing my bags. My mum was in the kitchen next to the lounge. My brother was fast asleep, and my dogs were outside barking at something. Once again, we didn't have a cat at the time. I was getting ready to leave when I heard someone running down the hallway. I froze and looked in the direction of the noise. The footsteps were heavy, and it sounded like they were only 2 feet away. They lasted for a second, but they were clear as day. I continued looking for a few seconds to see what it was, but when nothing appeared, I ran to the kitchen with my bag and confirmed my mum was in the kitchen and the dogs were outside. That experience still gives me chills to this day, and I believe it was the same thing that my brother saw. The latest encounter I had was a year or 2 ago, and it was even more terrifying than the running footsteps. I was in bed late at night when I woke suddenly. I was wide awake, all systems on high alert. I tried to sit up to look around me, but soon realised that I had no control over my body. The only thing I could do was move my eyes. My head was propped up a little by a stiff pillow, and when I looked down towards the foot of my bed, I came face to face with a demon. It was human-like, but its skin was pitch black. Its hair was long down to its chin and jaw. It had a wide, shining white grin filled with shark-like teeth, and its eyes were wide and oval-shaped with sharp points pointing to the side of its head. They were glowing a bright violet and white colour, looking directly at me. Something strange about it was that it had a head and shoulders similar to the size of mine, but it was really short. My bed's about 40 centimetres tall, and only this thing's head and shoulders were above my bed, like the rest was either non-existent or phasing through the floor. I stared at it for a few seconds, absolutely terrified, before I thought, I have to move. I'm generally the type of person who try to fight something that scares me instead of freezing or running. I concentrated as hard as I could, summoning any and all strength I had. After about half a minute of straining, I could feel myself starting to regain some control. So using all the strength I had, I shot my upper body forward and swung my fist at it. As soon as I did so, it disappeared. I looked around confused and wondering what in the 7 rings of shit just happened. Pardon my French. I just sat there for a few minutes trying to wrap my head around this, before exhaustion finally took hold of me and I fell asleep again. So far, I haven't seen that thing again. Personally, I think it was a shadow demon. They're generally pretty harmless. They try to break into your mind and subconscious. So when your mind is weak, they'll appear to you in a form that they know you'll fear, since they feed on fear. This also explains why my brother and I saw it in different forms. He saw it in the shape of a creature from a movie that he was afraid of, and I saw it as a demon. Thanks for listening to my family's encounters